Charlotte Finch did not flinch when the butler set her supper tray on the servant's stair instead of a table. She only picked it up and thanked him and carried it up herself. She was a parson's daughter with no dowry and no beauty anyone had ever thought worth naming. She was the 6th governess to come to Ashcott Hall in 2 years. The fog came up the Shropshire Valley behind her carriage, and the great cold house swallowed her whole. That first evening, the Dowager had her stand before the assembled household. Before the 14 of them, the housekeeper, the maids, the footman, the cook, all in a row. Lady Ophelia Vane looked her over, from her plain bonnet to her worn boots, and did not trouble to lower her voice. "A plainer creature than the last," she said. "The Duke will not notice you, and the boy will not speak to you. You may go up." And the boy Thomas, 9 years old, the silent heir, had not said a single word in a year. Not since the coach accident that put both his parents in the ground. But here is the thing the fog did not know, and the Dowager did not know, and Charlotte herself least of all. Months from that first cold night, in a schoolroom lit by one candle, alone with the coldest man in the county, she would ask him the one question no one at Ashcott was ever permitted to ask. And he would answer her. "I had not yet met you," he would say, and it would undo them both. But I am ahead of myself. Let me put that candle out for now. If you have ever been judged by your dress instead of your heart, this story is for you. Before we go on, subscribe and comment the town you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let me take you back to the fog. The carriage had come slow up the long drive, past hedges gone wild and a gatehouse with a broken pane, and Charlotte had pressed her face to the glass to see the house she was to serve. Ashcott Hall stood grey against a greyer sky. Beautiful once. You could see that it had been beautiful. Now half the windows were dark, and ivy had got into the stone, and the fountain in the forecourt held nothing but dead leaves and rain. She was not disappointed. Charlotte had learned long ago not to spend her hopes before she had something to spend them on. Her father had died the winter before with a leaking roof over his head and £40 of debt, and she had buried him in a borrowed black gown, and she had come away from the parsonage with one trunk and a character reference and the knowledge that a plain woman of 28 had better be useful, because she would never be anything else. That was simply the arithmetic of her life. She had done the sum many times. Plainness had already decided the matter. She would never be anyone's reason for anything. So she asked only for a place where she was not disposable. That was the whole of it. The butler, a stooped man named Reeves, showed her in through a side door as though the front were kept for people who mattered. The hall inside was vast and echoing and smelled of cold ash and old wax. A single lamp burned on a table meant for a dozen. Charlotte followed him up a stair that turned and turned, past portraits she could not see in the dark, up to the schoolroom floor under the eaves. "You'll dine up here," Reeves said. "Her ladyship prefers it." "Of course," said Charlotte. He hesitated at the door. Some small kindness worked in his old face and lost. "The last one left in the night," he said. "Didn't even wait for morning." And he went away down the stairs and left her standing in a cold room with a cold grate and a bed with a thin blanket, and she set down her trunk, and she did not weep, because weeping was a thing you did when there was time for it. She met the children the next morning. Beatrice found her first. Beatrice was 7, and round-cheeked, and could no more hold her tongue than a kettle can hold its steam. She came into the schoolroom talking, and did not stop. "Are you the new one? You are, aren't you? I knew you'd be plain. Aunt Ophelia said you would. She says it every time. But the last one was pretty, and she was horrid, and she pinched, so I'd rather have plain. Are you cross? You don't look cross. Do you know any stories?" The last one only knew French verbs. "I know a great many stories," Charlotte said. "But first I should like to know your name." "Beatrice," That's Thomas. She jerked her head at the window. And there, in the window seat, with his knees drawn up and his back to the room, was the boy. Thin, dark-haired, still as a held breath. He did not turn. He did not speak. He looked out at the ruined fountain as though something out there might come back if he only watched long enough. Charlotte had been told about the silence. She had not been told how loud it was. It filled the room. It pressed on the ears. "He doesn't talk," Beatrice said, in the too loud whisper of a child. "Not since. Aunt says he's broken. Uncle Nicholas doesn't say anything about it at all." "He isn't broken," Charlotte said, and she said it plainly, as a matter of fact, the way you'd say the grass was green. "He's waiting. That's a different thing." Beatrice considered this with enormous seriousness. Thomas did not move, but his shoulders, Charlotte saw it, and pretended she had not, his shoulders came down, just a little, the smallest measure, as though someone in this cold house had finally said the true thing out loud. She met the Duke that evening, and it went worse. He was in the library, and Reeves announced her, and Nicholas Vane, Duke of Ashcott, looked up from a great deal of paper spread across a great deal of desk, and regarded her with eyes the grey of the house itself. He was 38, and might have been carved from the same cold stone. He was not unkind. That was the strange thing she would think of later. He was not unkind the way the Dowager was unkind, with relish. He was simply somewhere very far away, behind a wall so high and so old that Charlotte doubted he could see over it himself. "Miss Finch," he said, "you come recommended as patient. You will need to be. My nephew does not speak. My niece does not stop. My aunt runs this house and will tell you so. Teach them their letters and their sums and keep them from underfoot. That is all I require." He looked back down at his papers. "You may go." "Your Grace," said Charlotte, and turned to leave, and at the door a thing on the desk caught her eye. A great ledger, brown leather, gone soft at the corners with handling, and a thin, sharp gentleman standing at the Duke's elbow with his hand laid flat upon it, as if to keep it shut. "The rent books, Your Grace," the thin man was saying. "You needn't trouble over the figures. I have them well in hand. No one need open these but me." "Thank you, Corbin," said the Duke, without looking up. Charlotte went out. She thought nothing of it. Why would she? A land agent and his ledger. She had a cold room and 2 children and a house that hated her, and a great brown book that no one but Mr. Corbin ever opened was the very least of what she had to think about that night. She learned the rest of it in pieces, the way one learns the shape of a dark room by walking into things. She learned that a caller came from a bank, Ferris and Halloway, of London, a soft-footed man in a good coat, who was shown into the library and stayed an hour and left without his smile. She learned it because she was on the stair when the Dowager came out after him, and she heard the old woman murmur to Corbin, "Lo, Michaelmas will settle everything." It must. She did not know what it meant. Michaelmas was a day in September, the feast of the angel, the day quarter rents came due. That was all it meant to her then. She filed it away and forgot it. She learned that the house was cold, not from meanness, but from want, that the fires were small because the coal was dear, that the maids were few because the wages were thin, that a duke could be poor, which she had not known was possible, could be land-rich and pocket-empty, a great name over an empty strongbox. She learned it the night she found the scullery girl. The girl could not have been more than 12. Charlotte came down late for a candle, the housekeeper having given her a stub that gutted out by 9, and she found the child asleep, sitting up in the scullery passage, with her knees to her chest and no shawl and her lips gone blue-grey in the draught. A little maid, worked till she dropped, too far down the order to be given even a blanket. Charlotte had one candle end in her pocket and a shawl on her own shoulders. It was cold in her room and would be colder without the shawl. She thought about it for the length of one breath. Then she put the shawl round the sleeping child and tucked it, and left her own candle end burning low on the ledge so the girl would not wake in the dark. And she went back up the turning stair in the cold and the black, with her hands out before her, feeling for the wall. That is the whole of what I can tell you about Charlotte Finch's heart. She gave away her light and her warmth to a child who could do nothing for her in return, on her second night in that house, when she had precious little of either to spare. Remember it. It is the thing the Dowager could not see, and the thing that will, in the end, be seen by everyone. The days went hard. Thomas would not learn. He would not refuse exactly. Refusal would have been a kind of speech, and he had given up speech. He simply sat. She would set a slate before him, and he would look through it. She would read aloud, and he would look out the window. Beatrice learned everything twice over, and chatted enough for 3 children, and Thomas sat in his window like a small grey ghost, and Charlotte began to understand why 5 governesses had left. It was not cruelty that drove them out. It was the silence. You could pour yourself into that silence day after day and hear nothing come back, and a person could stand only so much of that, and the Dowager watched and waited for her to fail. Lady Ophelia had a genius for the small humiliation. Not the grand blow, the pinprick. She would come into the schoolroom unannounced and find fault with the fire, the light, the children's collars, the governess's plain gown. "That dress again, Miss Finch. Have you no other?" she would remark to a visitor in Charlotte's hearing. "The new governess. Yes, plain, isn't she? One can't have a pretty one about a widowed house, it makes talk. We chose her precisely because no one will look at her twice." She said it as though Charlotte were a chair. And Charlotte stood and kept her face still and said, "Yes, my lady." And something in her that had been young once got a little older each time. But there was the globe. It stood in the corner of the schoolroom on a brass stand, small, tarnished, the size of a large orange, a little brass world with the countries etched into it and the seas gone green with age. It was the one thing in that room the children loved, and Charlotte discovered, almost by accident, that when she spun it, Thomas watched. He watched the countries go by under her finger. So she began to teach by it. She would spin the globe and stop it with a finger and tell them what was there: the Spice Islands, the ice at the poles, the long coast of the Americas. Beatrice asked 100 questions. Thomas said nothing, but he came down out of his window seat the first week and stood at the globe and put his own small finger on the brass, and that was more than the 5 before her had got in a year. And one afternoon Charlotte spun it slow and stopped it and said, gently, "Your father sailed here once. To India. Before you were born. He sent your grandmother a shawl the colour of a sunset, your aunt told me. He stood on a ship right about here, and she touched the little brass sea. She did not know that anyone was watching. But the Duke had come up the stair. He came sometimes, silent, and stood at doors, and left again, keeping his distance from a grief he did not know how to hold. He stood now in the schoolroom doorway, unseen, and he watched a plain woman in a worn gown put his dead brother's finger back on the map of the world for a boy who could not speak. He watched Thomas lean in. He watched the child's face, and it was the child's face he could not bear, because it was his brother's, and because for one moment there was something in it that was not grief. And the Duke of Ashcott, who feared nothing that carried a name, could not make himself cross that threshold. He turned and went back down, and no one heard him go. That was the first of it, the first crack in the ice, though neither of them would have called it that. He never spoke of it, but something had got in through the eyes and would not come out again. Downstairs, meanwhile, Mr. Corbin was busy about the Duke's ruin and calling it care. Charlotte did not see it, she had no reason to, but it went on beneath her all the same. Silas Corbin was a patient man with a soft voice and a face that agreed with you, and he had the running of the estate, and he had had it for years, since before the accident, since the old Duke's time, and he stood at the Dowager's shoulder in the yellow drawing-room and made his soft arguments. "The London bank will not wait past Michaelmas, my lady," he said. "The mortgage falls due. £14,000, and the rents will not cover it, not this year, not with the harvest what it was." He let that sit. There is one clean road. Lady Vivienne Cardross, 20,000 in her own right, and a name to match his graces. A word to her father, an understanding by the term day, and Ashcott is saved and no one the wiser. His grace need only agree to be sensible. He smiled his agreeing smile. "Before the term day, my lady. It ought to be settled before the term day." "He is not a sensible man," said the Dowager, "where his pride is concerned. But he loves the land." She looked at the cold hearth. "And he loves those children more than he'll say." "Yes, Vivienne, I'll see to it." Neither of them thought of the governess at all. Why would they? She was a plain thing in a worn gown, who taught letters under the eaves. She was not part of the arithmetic. Then came the harvest assembly, and everything the county thought it knew was made to stand up in a room and be looked at. The autumn assembly at Nettleford was the great event of the country year. The gentry of the whole valley in the assembly rooms, the candles lit, the long tables, the music, and, by long custom, the tenants' children and the great houses' children brought forward to recite. It was expected. And it was expected, that year, above all, that the heir of Ashcott would recite, that the county would see the boy who had lost his parents, and see that the great house went on, and be reassured. The Dowager arranged it. She would show the county a duke's nephew standing straight and speaking his verse. She had not, it seems, thought carefully about the fact that the boy did not speak. Charlotte begged her not to. Quietly, in the schoolroom, on her knees before the old woman, near enough. "My lady, he isn't ready. To stand before all of them, it may set him back a year. Please, let Beatrice recite. Let me stand with him and only bow." "Not this. Not yet. He is a vane," said the Dowager. "He will stand where vanes stand. And you will teach him his lines. If you cannot, I shall know the reason." And that was the end of it. So on the night, in the bright rooms, before the whole county, before the Duke standing dark at the side and the Dowager seated in state, Thomas Vane was led out to a little space of floor, and the room went kind and quiet and waiting, and everyone smiled the encouraging smile people keep for a sad child. And Thomas stood there, and the silence came up in him, and he opened his mouth, and nothing came, nothing at all, and his face began to break, and a whisper started somewhere in the room, and a woman tittered behind her fan, and the Duke took one step forward with a face like a man watching a boy drown, and no water near. And Charlotte Finch, who had no station, no name, no business, stepping onto that floor before her betters, walked out into the middle of the room and knelt down. She knelt so that her plain face was level with the boy's. She did not touch him. She did not look at the county. She looked at Thomas, only at Thomas, as if the two of them were alone at the schoolroom globe, and she began, very low, to say the verse. Not for the room. For him. Under her breath, just the two of them, the way they had said it 100 times upstairs. "Come," said the wind to the leaves one day, and she paused and waited and let the next word hang there in the small warm space between their two faces. And Thomas, the boy who had not spoken in a year, moved his lips, and the next word came out of him. Barely, "A thread of sound.come," he breathed, "over the meadow with me and play." And she said the next line with him, their voices together so low the whole grand hall leaned in and held its breath to hear, a room full of silk and candlelight bent silent toward a kneeling governess and a whispering child, and they finished it, the two of them, together, all the way to the end. And when the last word was, said Thomas was not crying, and Charlotte was not crying, and for the length of a heartbeat, nobody in that room made a sound at all. Then it broke. But it broke wrong for Charlotte. Some clapped, moved, not knowing quite why. But the Dowager's face was white with fury, because a servant had knelt on the floor of the assembly and made a spectacle, had put herself forward, had forgotten her place before the entire county, and the county murmured it too, behind the fans. Who was she? The governess, kneeling, making an exhibition. One doesn't. A woman of that sort ought to know better. She had turned the boy's failure into a scene, and the scene had a servant at the middle of it, and that would not do. The mismatch was seen now. The plain nobody who had reached too high. They looked at her and did not like what the looking told them about themselves. But one man in that room did not murmur. The Duke of Ashcott stood at the side, and he looked at Charlotte Finch, and for the first time since she had come to his house, he did not look through her. He looked at her. At the plain, steady face, at the worn gown she'd been mocked for a dozen times. At the woman who had walked out into a hostile room and knelt on the floor and reached his brother's son when his own aunt's arrangements and his own cold love had only made the boy drown in public. Something moved in the Duke's grey face that had not moved in a long while. He did not know its name. But he would not forget it. They did not speak of it on the drive home. The Dowager did, at length, cold and clipped, about impertinence and place and what the county would say. Charlotte sat with Beatrice asleep against her and Thomas silent in the corner, silent again, the one word spent. And she said, "Yes, my lady, and I understand, my lady," and looked out at the dark, and thought that she had likely lost her place, and had done the only thing she could have done, and would do it again. She was wrong about losing her place, because upstairs something had turned, and the turning would not stop. It showed itself in small ways, in ways so small that Charlotte, who had trained herself never to hope, almost did not let herself see them. Her tea. She took it without sugar, always had, sugar being a thing a parson's family learned to do without, and one grey morning her tea simply came without sugar, on the tray, without her asking, when it had come sweet and wrong every day for a fortnight before. She looked at the cup a long moment. She said nothing. But someone had noticed. Someone in that house, where no one noticed her, had noticed how she took her tea, and had seen to it. Beatrice, asleep one cold evening on the schoolroom floor, where she dropped off over her drawing, and Charlotte coming in to find her covered with a man's coat, a good dark coat, laid over the child by hands that had gone away before anyone saw. The Duke's coat. Charlotte stood over the sleeping girl with her heart doing a thing she had told it firmly, years ago, that it was no longer permitted to do. The schoolroom door. It had always been shut, kept shut, a servant's room, a nursery, out of the way. And now it was left open. On purpose. She was sure of it after the third day. Left open so that the sounds of the schoolroom, Beatrice's chatter, the spin of the globe, Charlotte's reading voice, could travel down the cold stair into the cold house. As though someone below wanted to be able to hear that there was one warm room left at Ashcott, even if he could not make himself come up into it. She told herself it meant nothing. A plain woman of 28 does not let herself think a duke has noticed how she takes her tea. That way lay only more of the old ache. So she noticed, and she said nothing, and she kept her hope in the small locked box where she kept all her hopes, and she went on with the letters and the sums and the globe. But there was one thing she noticed that she could not make mean nothing, because it was only numbers, and numbers do not care about a plain woman's heart. The children had small allowances, a shilling a quarter from the estate, an old custom no one had troubled to stop. Charlotte kept the account of it, as governesses do, in a little book, farthing by farthing. So the children could learn their sums on their own small money. And to reconcile her little book against the estate she was given, one afternoon a single page copied out from the great rent accounts by a clerk. Just a page, just the tenants of the near farms and what they paid. And it did not reconcile. Not by much. Not anywhere it would show to a man skimming the total. But Charlotte Finch had kept her dying father's accounts to the farthing on £40 of debt, and she could add a column in her sleep, and the column did not come right. A cottage that she knew, she had walked past it, was let and lived in, showed as empty, no rent. A rent that the tenant himself had mentioned to her at the assembly, proud of paying it, £11. Showed on the page as £9. £2 gone, a cottage's rent gone. Small holes. But holes in a book that was meant to have none, in a house that was drowning for want of £14,000 by Michaelmas. She sat with the page a long while as the light went. It was not her business. She was the governess. The rents were Mr. Corbyn's affair, Mist. Corbyn, whose ledger no one but he ever opened, who kept his hand flat upon the brown book as though to keep it shut. It was not her business, and a wise woman in a precarious place does not go looking into the master's accounts. She knew that. She folded the page away. But she did not forget it. Charlotte never forgot a thing that did not come right. That was the trouble with her. It was the making of her, and it very nearly the unmaking, and it was in the end the saving of them all, but that is further on, and I am getting ahead again. Downstairs the arithmetic tightened. Lady Vivienne Cardross came to Ashcott. The Dowager summoned her, and she came, 24 and handsome and gowned, in a season's worth of what the whole schoolroom cost in a year, £20,000 walking up the drive in silk. And Charlotte saw her from the schoolroom window, saw her step down from her carriage and look up at the grey house with the eye of a woman pricing a thing she means to own. And Charlotte went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the draught. 20,000 against 14 owed. She did not know the figures yet. But she knew a bride when she saw one shown into a poor house, and she knew what a governess was worth against £20,000, which was less than nothing, which was a chair. And that same week, at the Globe, the thing happened that Charlotte would keep in her heart for the rest of her life. It was late. Beatrice had gone to bed. Thomas would not, quite. He lingered, as he sometimes did now, at the brass globe in the last of the candle, spinning it slow under one finger. Charlotte sat near, mending, not pressing him, letting the quiet be a kind quiet for once, and not a wound. He spun the globe. He stopped it. He put his finger, she saw, on the little brass sea off the long coast, the sea she had touched weeks before, and told them their father had sailed. And Thomas Vane opened his mouth, and into the quiet so soft she nearly missed it, so soft she would wonder later if she had dreamed it. The boy said one word. Papa. Just that. Just the one word. To her, at the Globe, with his finger on the sea. And then he shut his mouth again and looked at her, frightened of what he'd done, as though the word might be taken from him or bring the grief down. And Charlotte did not fall on him, or weep, or make a scene. She only nodded, slow, and said, as steady as she could make her voice while her whole heart was breaking open, "Yes, that's where he sailed. He'd be glad you know it." And Thomas breathed out, and leaned, just slightly, against her arm. And they sat there, the two of them, at the little brass world, in the last of the candle. She told the Duke. She had to. It was too great a thing to keep, and it was his to have. She went down and asked Reeves to tell his Grace that the boy had spoken, one word, and would his Grace wish to know it. And the Duke came. He came up the turning stair in the dead of night to the schoolroom he could never make himself enter, and Charlotte told him, quietly, in the doorway, what his nephew had said and where and how. "Papa," she said, "at the Globe. To me. His first word in a year. Your Grace." And the Duke of Ashcott stood in the doorway of his own schoolroom and looked at the sleeping shape of the boy through the half-dark, and his face, his cold, exact, walled-off face, his face came apart. Just for a moment. Just enough that Charlotte, who was watching, saw the man behind the wall, saw how much he loved the child, and how far he had shut himself away from feeling it, saw the grief and the hope war in him. He opened his mouth. To go in, perhaps, to go to the boy, to say something to the woman who had given him this, and he could not. The wall was too old. He shut his mouth. He looked at Charlotte, and there was something in the look that was almost an apology, almost a reaching, and he said only, "Lo, thank you, Miss Finch," and turned, and went back down the stair into the cold. And Charlotte stood in the doorway and watched him go, and thought, "He is not cold. He is not cold at all. He is only kept. Like a fire banked so long it has forgotten it can burn." She should have gone to bed. But she was too full of the boy, of the word, of the Duke's face coming apart in the dark, to sleep. So she sat up by the low fire, with the folded page in her lap, the page of rents that did not reconcile, and she looked at it again by the last of the light. And she thought about the cottage let, and lived in and marked empty, and she thought about a soft-voiced land agent, with his hand flat on a brown ledger, saying, "No one need open these but me." And she thought about £14,000 owed, and a house drowning and £20,000 in silk come up the drive to save it, and she began, for the first time, to wonder if the sums of Ashcott had ever come right at all, and who had seen to it that no one ever checked. She would go to bed. She would not meddle. It was not her place. That was the last calm night the house would have for a long while, because in the grey hour before that, dawn down the cold passage, a small voice that had waited a year to speak began to call, thin and frightened and burning. Beatrice came running up the passage in her nightgown, her round face white, and beat on Charlotte's door. Miss Finch, come. It's Thomas. He's ever so hot. He won't wake right. He's talking to Papa, and Papa isn't there." And Charlotte was up and out the door with her shawl in her hand before the child had finished, running down the cold passage toward the room where the heir of Ashcott lay burning in the dark. And behind that, further down still, the Dowager's door, and the word she would speak when she found the governess where she was forbidden to be. And further down than that, in a house that did not yet know it was drowning, 14,000 reasons the boy in the burning bed had better live, and better be a vain, and better never need a plain woman at all. Charlotte Finch put her hand to that fevered forehead in the dark, and felt the heat of it come up through her palm like a warning, and knew the long night had only just begun. The heat did not break easy. It fought her. All that long night Charlotte sat by the small bed and did the small things. She wrung the cloth. She laid it on his forehead. She wrung it again when it went warm, which was fast, too fast. Beatrice she had sent back to her own bed with a lie about how it was nothing, only a chill, only a night. The lie sat badly, but the child had gone. Thomas talked to his father in the dark, not words she could always follow. A boy's fever talk, run together urgent. He asked where the horses had gone. He asked was Papa cold. Once, clear as a bell, he said, "Wait for me," and Charlotte took his hot little hand in both of hers and held it hard, as if she could hold him on this side of the door by grip alone. "He is here," she said. "Your Papa is here. And so am I. Nobody is leaving." The door opened without a knock. It was the Duke. He had not undressed. He stood in the doorway in the same coat he had worn at dinner, and his face, which she had only ever seen shut, was not shut now. Reeves had woken him. Or the house had. A house knows when a child is burning in it. "How long?" he said. "Since 2. The fever climbs." He did not go for the physician. The physician was 11 miles off, and the roads were bad, and they both knew a horse would take 3 hours it might not have. He took off his coat instead. He rolled his sleeves like a working man. And he came to the other side of his brother's son and sat. They did not speak much through the worst of it. There was nothing to say that was not the child. Near 4 he took a turn with the cloth so her hands could rest, and she watched a Duke wring water into a basin as careful as a nursemaid, and something in her chest that she had kept shut for 28 years came loose a little in the dark. Down the passage a door opened. Heels, the Dowager, in her wrapper, grey plait down her back. Come to see what disorder was afoot in her house at 4 a.m, she took in the room. The governess where she had been forbidden. The Duke in his shirt-sleeves. The basin, the cloths, the burning boy. "Miss Finch," she said, low and precise, "you were told to keep to your room. There are people whose place it is to sit with sickness. It is not yours. Go up." Charlotte did not move. She had never in her life not moved when the Dowager spoke. She moved now only her thumb on the back of Thomas's hand, small circles, the way you gentle a frightened thing. "Aunt," the Duke did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "She stays." 2 words. And the Dowager looked at her nephew, and looked at the plain woman he had set above her word, and Charlotte watched the old lady do a sum behind her eyes, and not like the answer it came to. She went. The door closed soft, which was worse than a slam. Dawn came grey at the window, and with the grey, the boy's breathing changed. Charlotte felt it before she saw it. The rasp went out of it. The little hand in hers, which had been dry and blazing all night, turned damp. Sweat stood on his lip. His face, which had been red, went blotched, then paled, and he sighed, a whole, deep, ordinary sigh, the sigh of a child settling into true sleep, and slept. She laid her hand flat on his chest and felt it rise and fall, even and slow. "It's broken," she whispered. "The fever's broken. He'll do." She had not known she was crying until she tried to say it, and could not at first get the words to hold their shape. She pressed her free hand to her mouth. 28 years of not being anyone's reason, and here she was undone by a sleeping boy's ordinary breath. Across the bed, the Duke of Ashcott put his face in his hands. For a moment neither of them was anything they were supposed to be. Not Duke, not Governess. Just 2 tired people who had sat up all night and won. When he lifted his head his eyes were wet and he did not hide it, and he looked at her across the small saved body of the heir of Ashcott, and he said, very low, Charlotte, just her name. No Miss, no Finch. Her name, the way you say a name you have been holding in your mouth a while. She should not have answered it. She knew every reason she should not. Nicholas, she said. And there it was. The ice had a name now. You cannot unname a thing. Neither of them said more. He rose and drew the blanket up over his brother's boy and stood a moment looking down at him. Then he took up his coat and did not put it on and went out, and Charlotte sat on in the growing light with the child's hand in hers and knew that something had crossed a line in the dark that could not be walked back across. Thomas mended the way children do, all at once. Within the week he was up. Within a fortnight he was a nuisance, which Charlotte thought the loveliest word in the language, and the house, thawing, went on thawing, and would not stop, and everyone in it saw the thaw but the 2 it was happening to. It came in small things. It always does. Her tea began to come without sugar. She had taken it without sugar all her life, and no one had ever noticed, and now here it was on the schoolroom tray, right, every morning, and no one said who had seen to it. She found Beatrice one afternoon asleep on the schoolroom floor with a book fallen off her, and over the child tucked close, the Duke's own coat. He had passed and seen the sleeping girl and taken the coat off his own back rather than wake her. He had not mentioned it. Charlotte folded it after and had to sit down. The schoolroom door, which she had always kept shut against the cold and the Dowager both, began to be left open. Not by her. She would come in and find it open and know he had passed and left it so that the sound of the children came down into the cold house where before there had been no children's sound at all. He mended the broken latch on the schoolroom press himself. She came in and it worked, and there were his tools left on the sill, forgotten or not forgotten. She could never be sure. They took to reading of an evening, the 4 of them, when the day's lessons were done. He would come up on the excuse of the children and stay for the book. She read, and he listened, and once she looked up mid-sentence and found him not looking at the fire but at her, and neither of them looked away as fast as they should have. And Beatrice, blessed oblivious Beatrice, talked on into the silence and saved them both. But the house was drowning under all this warmth, and Charlotte, who was sharp with figures, had not forgotten what she'd seen. She had the copied page still. £11 on one line, shown as 9 on the rent page. £2 gone into heir, a cottage let and lived in and marked empty, and a soft-voiced man with his hand flat on a brown ledger, saying, "No one need open these but me." And she watched Silas Corbin come and go that autumn, and she watched him get anxious, which a thief does when the clock runs down. Because the clock was running. Michaelmas was coming. £14,000 fell due to Ferris and Halloway at the September quarter day, and the house had not got £14,000, and everyone knew where the £14,000 was meant to come from. It came up the drive in a carriage, in silk. Lady Vivienne Cardross was 24 and handsome and worth £20,000, and she arrived at Ashcott as a bride arrives who has already decided the house is hers. The Dowager had summoned her. Corbin had pressed for it. 20,000 against 14 owed, the sum did itself. Charlotte watched from the schoolroom window as the carriage came, and told herself it was nothing to her, and knew she lied. Corbin pressed hardest now, in these last weeks. Charlotte heard him once through the library door, low and urgent to the Dowager. "It must be settled at the term day, my lady." "Fixed," announced. "The bank will not wait past Michaelmas, and there is no other £20,000 in Shropshire will come to a mortgaged house. His Grace must be made to see it. Made to see it, as if a man were a ledger you could balance by making him marry." And still the schoolroom kept its warmth. And on a night near the end of it, with the children asleep and the candle low, Charlotte did the reckless thing. They were at the Globe, the brass globe on its brass stand, in the corner where it had always stood, the globe that had brought a mute boy his first word. He had come up for the reading, and the children had gone down, and neither of them had found the reason to end the evening. She turned the globe, idle, and it caught the candle and threw a little band of light around the dark schoolroom wall, and she watched it go around, and she was tired, and the tiredness made her brave, or foolish, or both. "May I ask your Grace a question?" she said. "That is none of my business." "You may ask me anything," he said. "That is not the same as my answering." She kept her eyes on the globe. It was easier. "Why did you never wed?" The globe went around. She had no right to it, and they both knew she had no right to it. A governess does not ask a duke why he is not married. It was the one door in the whole house she had no business opening. He was quiet so long she thought he would not answer, and she was already ashamed, already framing the retreat. And then he answered, and his voice was not the Duke's voice at all. "I had not yet met you," he said. The globe went still under her hand. She had stopped it without meaning to. She did not look at him. She could not. The candle guttered in some draught from the mended latch, steadied, burned on. Neither of them moved. There was the small tick of the fire, and nothing else in the whole cold house, and between them a thing said that could not be unsaid, laid down on the table like the ledger page she still carried, and just as dangerous. She should have said something. She said nothing. She was afraid that if she opened her mouth what came out would be true. He rose, at last, quiet, and bid her good night in a voice gone formal again, gone careful, as though the carefulness could put the thing back behind the door. It could not. She sat alone, after he had gone with the dead globe under her hand, and let herself, for one night only, believe it. She believed it until the next morning. She had gone down early for the children's milk, along the cold passage past the library, and the library door stood ajar, and inside were voices, and she stopped because she heard her own future being decided, and did not know it yet. Ferris and Halloway had sent a man. She heard the bank in the room, dry and patient, the voice of £14,000 come to collect. She heard Corbin, oily, quick. She heard the Dowager. And then she heard Nicholas, and what she heard him say stopped the milk jug in her hand. "Very well," he said, flat, tired, a man at the end of a road. "For Thomas's sake. For the land. If it must be Lady Vivienne, then let it be Lady Vivienne, and let it be done at Michaelmas, and let there be an end to it." That was all she heard. She did not hear the long silence before it. She did not hear the cost in the flatness. She did not stay to hear what came after, whether there was after. She had heard enough to understand, or to think she understood, that a night at a Globe was one thing and £14,000 was another, and that she had been a fool of 28 who ought to have known better, who had been told from the cradle that plainness had already decided she would never be anyone's reason, and who had let herself forget it for the length of one candle. She set the milk down very carefully so it would not spill, because a governess does not make a mess, and she went up and she did not cry, because there was the day's lessons, and she taught them. Lady Vivienne found her that afternoon in the passage. Charlotte had a child by each hand, Thomas and Beatrice, coming down from the schoolroom. Lady Vivienne looked at the three of them the way you look at furniture you mean to have moved. "You are the governess," she said. "Yes, when I am mistress here, the children will go to school, both of them. The boy to Harrow when he's of age, the girl to somewhere in Bath. A house new married does not want," and here she smiled, and it was a lovely smile, and Charlotte would remember it all her life. The encumbrance always underfoot. The encumbrance. She said it in front of them. Thomas's hand went tight in Charlotte's. He had a year's silence behind him, and he understood every word, and Charlotte felt him understand it, and something in her that had been bending all morning went hard as a nail. She said, quite level, "They are children, my lady, not encumbrances." And they hear you. And she took them past her and up, and did not look back, and Lady Vivienne Cardress had shown, to the one witness who mattered, exactly what she was. That night Charlotte gave her notice. She wrote it plain. She thanked His Grace for his kindness, and asked to be released at the quarter-day, and she did not say why, because the why was hers, and she would keep it. She had one trunk. She had come with one trunk, and she would leave with one trunk, and she began, that night, to pack it. But she was sharp with figures. And she could not leave, not the house. The sum. It sat in her like a stone, £2 on one page. A cottage marked empty that a family slept in, 14,000 owed, and no one but Corbin ever opening the book that would say whether 14,000 was even true. She was going. She would be gone in days. And once she was gone there would be no one left in that house who could add. So she did the second reckless thing, and it was worse than the first. She went down in the dead of night to the library, where the great brown leather rent ledger lay on the desk under the land agent's daytime hand, and by a single candle she opened the book that no one but Mr. Corbin ever opened. It took her most of the night. She was fast with figures, and even so it took her most of the night, because the theft was patient, and it was old. He had not been greedy in any 1 year. That was the cleverness of it, £2 here. A cottage's whole rent there, the cottage marked empty on the book, and the money in his pocket. A tenant's arrears written off on paper and collected in fact. Year upon year upon year of small, careful sums that no one added, because no one but Corbin ever opened the book. And when she carried them down and totted the columns and carried again, and made herself do it twice because she could not believe it, the figure at the foot of her own page came out near £9,000. £9,000. Gone. Not lost, not spent, not sunk in bad harvests. Stolen, carried off in a land agent's satchel over a dozen quiet years. She sat back in the cold library with the candle burning down, and understood, all at once, what she was holding. The estate was not ruined. Nicholas's brother had not run it into the ground and left his children a drowning house. It had been robbed. The 14,000 owed to Ferris and Halloway need never have been owed at all. There had been money. Corbyn had it, and the marriage to £20,000 that was to save it all, the marriage was not needed. It had never been needed. It was a mercenary bargain built on a thief's arithmetic, and if the theft were shown, the whole cold necessity of it fell to the floor. She could have gone to him. She thought about it, sitting there. She could have taken the ledger to his door and knocked and shown him, and stayed to be thanked, and stayed for what the thanking might become. She thought about the globe and the word he'd said, and the coat over the sleeping child. But she had heard him in the library. Very well, for Thomas's sake. For the land. She would not be the plain governess who used a thief's ledger to buy her way back into a duke's regard. She would not have him choose her because she had made herself useful. If he came to her at all, it would not be because she had balanced his accounts. So she did the hardest thing of the three. She copied nothing. She left the whole of it. She marked the ledger at the pages that told the tale, and she wrote out, in her plain, clear hand, the sum and how she'd found it, and where the empty marked cottages truly stood. And she set the ledger open on the schoolroom table where he would find it. Because he came to the schoolroom now, it was the one place in the house he came. She weighted the page with the brass globe so it would not blow, and in the grey before dawn, the same grey hour a small voice had once called her down a cold passage, Charlotte Finch took up her one trunk and went out of Ashcott Hall without a word to anyone, and walked down the drive she had walked up in the fog, and left the proof behind her, and told no one where she was going, because it was not her place, and never had been, and she had let herself forget it for the length of one candle. She got a post at the village school in Nettleford. A mean room, a dozen farm children, a fraction of the wage. It was honest work, and it was hers, and no one there had ever told her she was plain, because to a room of 6-year-olds a woman who is kind is not plain at all. She taught them their letters. She waited for the ache to go down. It did not go down. At Ashcott, the Duke of Ashcott came up to the schoolroom to find his ward, and found instead an open ledger under a brass globe. He read it standing. He read it a second time sitting, because his legs would not quite hold him through the first. He knew figures well enough to check hers, and he checked hers, and hers were right. £9,000. The empty cottages. The written-off arrears. 12 years of it, in a hand he had trusted, in a book he had let another man keep, because a duke does not stoop to rent rolls. Below the sum, in the plain, clear hand he had come to know from the children's copybooks, she had written one line and no more. Not a plea, not a farewell. Only, the estate was never ruined, Your Grace. It was robbed. You do not need her money. He sent for Corbyn at once. The land agent came smiling, and stopped smiling in the library doorway, because the ledger was open on the desk and the Duke was standing behind it, and no one but Corbyn was ever meant to open that book. Your Grace, he began. £11, said Nicholas, shown as 9, on the Marsh Cottage line, Michaelmas, 5 years running. Explain it to me. Corbyn's face did several things. Charlotte would have known the sum going on behind his eyes. The Duke read it well enough without her. The man reached for bluster, for the roads, for bad years, for the tenant's dishonesty, for anything, and the Duke let him talk himself empty, and then said, very quiet, the quiet Charlotte would have recognized, there is a cottage on this book marked empty these 6 years. I rode out this morning. There is washing on the line and 3 children in the yard, and a woman who says she has paid her rent to you every quarter of her life. Now, explain it to me. And Corbyn had no explanation, because there was none, and the emptiness of him in that moment was the whole of it. He was led out that same day to the magistrate at Nettleford, and the Duke rode with the constable himself, and at the magistrate's door he said to the land agent one dry thing, the only thing, and it was this: "You kept the only book in the house I should have read myself." Then the bank. Nicholas took the ledger to Ferris and Halloway and laid the theft on the table, 12 years of it, and told them the estate was good, had always been good, that near £9,000 would be recovered from the agent's property and his bondsman, and there was land to make up the rest at an honest term day, and that they would have their £14,000 without a shilling of any woman's dowry, and they might wait the quarter for it, or he would take his family's business to a house that could add. They waited, and then there was Lady Vivienne. She was in the drawing-room at Ashcott with the Dowager, going over the wedding that was not going to happen, when the Duke came in and told her, without dressing it, that there would be no engagement, that the estate stood on its own feet, that he thanked her for her visit, and her carriage was called. She did not take it as a lady should. She had come for a duke and a house, and she was being sent home with neither, and the handsome face went ugly, and she said things about plain governesses who forget their place, having guessed, being no fool, exactly where the wind had shifted from. She said them to the Dowager, expecting the Dowager to agree. The Dowager Lady Ophelia Vane said nothing at all. She rang for Reeves, and when the carriage was at the door she did not rise, and she did not see her guest out, and Lady Vivienne Cardross walked to her carriage through a hall gone empty of everyone but the stooped old butler, and her parting sneer, so carefully aimed, met no one and fell in the empty hall, and that was the end of her. The Dowager sat on alone in the cold drawing-room a long while. She was a hard woman and a proud one, and she had been wrong, and she was old enough to know the difference between being wrong and admitting it, and to do the second was the harder thing. Nicholas came to her before he went for his horse. She looked at him. "The governess found it," she said. "Not a question. Charlotte found it. And you are going to her." "I am going to her." The old woman looked at her nephew a long moment, and Charlotte was not there to see what crossed her face, but the house afterwards said it was the nearest thing to gentleness the Dowager had shown in 20 years. "Then go," she said. "You have been half a man since your brother died. Go and be the whole of one." And she turned her face to the window so he would not see whatever was on it, and he went. The village school at Nettleford had one room and low benches, and a floor that had not been swept, because Charlotte swept it herself and had not got to it. There was chalk dust in the light from the one good window. There were a dozen farm children at their letters, and Charlotte Finch at the front in her one good plain dress, and the door opened, and the Duke of Ashcott stood in it, with his hat in his hand. The children went silent the way children do before a stranger. Charlotte turned. She had thought she was past being undone. She was not past it. She stood with the chalk in her hand, and could not, for a moment, do anything at all. He came in. He was too tall for the room, and he did not seem to mind. He crossed to the front of it, past the staring benches, and he stood before her, and there was not one particle of the Duke in him. There was only the man who had wrung a cloth over a burning child at 4 in the morning. "You asked me once," he said, "why I never wed." A child whispered. Someone shushed it. I gave you the true answer. I had not yet met you. But you heard a man in a library say a tired thing to a bank, and you did not stay to hear him refuse it. Because he did refuse it, Charlotte, I refused the whole cold bargain the same hour, and you were already gone. You left me a ledger and no forwarding, and the best thing I ever had, walked down my own drive in the dark, and I did not know until morning. She said, because she had to say something, and because she was who she was, the sums came right. Then the sums came right. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. You saved the house. Not her money. You, a parson's daughter with one trunk who could add. He turned the hat in his hands, this exact and unreachable man, gone shy as a boy in a schoolroom. I have told you the answer to your question. Let the rest of my life be the proof. Marry me. He did not offer a ring. Charlotte would tell it, in years to come, that he did not offer a ring first at all. He reached into his coat and brought out the brass globe from the Ashcott schoolroom, the small one, the one that had brought a mute boy his father's name, the one she had left waiting the page of a thief's arithmetic, and he held it out to her in both hands like the world it was. "You gave the children back their voices at this," he said. "Take it. Take all of it. Come home." Charlotte Finch, who had been told from the cradle that she would never be anyone's reason, looked at the globe and looked at the man holding it, and the whole of her plain, sharp, unwanted life came down to the reaching out of her two hands to take it. The children cheered before she could get a word out. They did not know what it was about. They knew a happy thing when it was in the room. They cheered and stamped on the swept and unswept floor, and Beatrice, for Beatrice had come, had ridden the whole way on the front of her uncle's saddle and been made to wait outside, and had not waited. Beatrice burst through the door, shouting that she had known. She had known all along. She had told Thomas so, and Thomas came behind her, and Thomas, the heir of Ashcott, who a year past had not had a word in him, opened his mouth in the crowded schoolroom and said, loud and clear and cross that no one was listening to him, "Miss Finch, are you going to be our aunt or not?" And she went down on her knees in the chalk dust the way she had gone down at the county assembly, and gathered the both of them in, and said yes into their hair, yes, yes, she was, and over their heads she looked up at Nicholas Vane, and did not need to say it to him again. He had heard it the first time. They were married at Ashcott before the quarter was out. The whole county came, because the whole county had judged her, and there is nothing the county likes so well as to have been present at a thing it can say afterward it was present at. They filled the church, and they lined the pews, and they craned to see the plain governess, with no dowry and no beauty, walk up to become Duchess of Ashcott, and the ones who had clucked at her dress at the harvest assembly clucked now at how well grief and figures had served her, and Charlotte let them cluck. She had one good plain dress, and she was married in it, and she had never in her life felt handsome, and she felt handsome that day. The Dowager Lady Ophelia Vane was seated where the whole county could see her. That was Nicholas's doing, and it was not unkind. It was only just. She sat in the front where every eye that swung to the governess become Duchess swung also, on its way, past the old woman who had said before the 14 of the household that the Duke would not notice her and the boy would not speak to her. Both had come untrue. The county remembered. The county always remembers. She bore it well, better than well. When the vows were made and the plain woman was a duchess, and Thomas, talking Thomas, who would not now be stopped, had piped up in the silence with something that made the whole church laugh, the dowager was seen to lean to the lady beside her, and to say one thing, dry and clear and final, the nearest to surrender the county ever heard from her. "She reached the boy," said Lady Ophelia Vane. "I never could." Rank had bowed to worth, in public, before the 14 of the household, and the whole of the county besides. It cost her. She paid it. And in the paying she came, at the very last, near to something like Grace herself. Spring came to Ashcott, 6 months on. The schoolroom windows stood open. That was the first change, and the whole of the house was in it. Windows that had been shut against the cold, and the dowager and the grief, now stood open on the south border, and the sound of children came down through the whole warm house, where once there had been no children's sound at all. Thomas spun the globe. He did it a dozen times a day, and told everyone the name of everywhere it stopped. Whether he knew the name or not, and if he did not know it, he made one up, and Charlotte let him, because a boy who has found his voice is owed a little license with geography. He talked too much now. Everyone said so. Everyone was glad. Beatrice and Charlotte were down on their knees in the south border, in the good dirt, putting in the things that would come up in summer, and Beatrice was telling a story that had no end and needed none. There was earth under the Duchess of Ashcott's nails, and she did not care. She had one trunk still, up in the great bedroom, kept for no reason but that she could not part with it. It had carried her whole life up that drive. It had turned out to be enough. Nicholas watched from the schoolroom doorway. It was the doorway he used to only pass. She had learned that about him. In the doorway, that first autumn, the man who stopped in doorways and did not come in, who watched the warm thing from the cold edge of it and did not let himself cross. He crossed now. He stood in the door a while, watching his wife and his brother's daughter with their hands in the dirt, and his brother's son making up the names of countries. And then he came out into the sun and down the border and got, to Reeves's lasting astonishment, down on his own knees in the earth beside them. Down on the service stair. Where a butler had once set a new governess's supper tray because there was no table thought worth the laying for the likes of her, there sat now a wide brown bowl. In it were the first apples of the year. Somebody put them there. Nobody quite owned to it. They were simply there, in the sun, on the stair, where the plain woman's tray had sat, and anyone passing might take one, and did. Some hearts are not cold. That was the whole of what Charlotte Finch had come to know, kneeling in the spring dirt of a house that had judged her by her dress and been taught, slow and hard, to know her by her heart. Some hearts are not cold, at all. They are only kept, shut and waiting through a long winter of griefs and duties and £14,000 for the one plain person who will trouble to open the book no one else will read, and add the sums no one else will add, and find, at the foot of the last cold column, that the estate was never ruined after all, only robbed of the one warm thing, and holding it, all along, in the dark, waiting to be met. Comment the town you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels.